The unjust airport incident. Sasha Obama's fight for fair treatment. Airports are more than just transit hubs. They are spaces where emotions run high. Travelers embark on new adventures, reunite with loved ones, or set off on critical business or academic journeys. But while airports symbolize movement and opportunity, they also serve as places where power dynamics are most visible. Strict security, bureaucratic procedures, and rigid enforcement of rules mean that any minor deviation from the norm can lead to significant consequences. For most travelers, these experiences are minor inconveniences, long lines, baggage checks, and the occasional unexpected delay. But for others, particularly people of color, these procedures can become moments of anxiety, frustration, and even humiliation. Implicit biases often creep into these seemingly neutral processes, leading to incidents that are neither accidental nor justifiable. It is within this complex environment that Sasha Obama's story unfolds. A story that begins as a routine airport experience, but quickly spirals into an incident that exposes deeper, systemic issues. For Sasha Obama, this trip was far from ordinary. As the daughter of former President Barack Obama, she had spent much of her life under the public eye. Yet, on this particular day, she wasn't traveling as the child of a world leader. She was a young scholar, eager to present her research at an esteemed conference in New York. This conference wasn't just another academic event. It was a gathering of brilliant minds in her field, a space where her hard work would be recognized, debated, and built upon. She had spent months preparing her presentation, meticulously reviewing data, fine-tuning her arguments, and rehearsing every aspect of her speech. This was an opportunity for her to establish herself as more than just the daughter of a famous politician. It was her chance to shine on her own merits. Like any traveler embarking on an important journey, Sasha arrived at the airport early, prepared for security checks and ready to board her flight. Dressed in a sleek beige trench coat, black jeans and white sneakers, she exuded confidence and professionalism. Her tote bag carried her laptop, research papers, and a personal notebook, filled with insights and notes she hoped to share during the conference. At that moment, Sasha had no reason to anticipate trouble. She was a model traveler. Her documents were in order, she had checked in online, and she had nothing to hide. But soon, she would find herself trapped in a situation that felt less like a travel inconvenience and more like an orchestrated act of discrimination. From the moment she stepped up to the check-in counter, there was a shift in energy. The woman behind the counter took one look at Sasha's passport and hesitated. There was no friendly greeting, no standard pleasantries, just a long, measured stare. And as the airline employee typed into her computer, she began to ask questions that seemed unnecessary. What is your purpose for traveling? Do you have official documentation to prove you're attending this conference? Who invited you? These weren't the usual check-in questions. Something about the woman's tone and body language made it clear that Sasha wasn't simply being processed like every other traveler. She was being scrutinized. And then came the moment that made it all painfully clear. The woman looked down at Sasha's passport again and paused when she saw the name. Obama, she murmured, as if tasting the word in her mouth. That name had once belonged to the most powerful man in the world, but here, at this airport counter, it seemed to mean something different. Instead of admiration or respect, there was something else in her gaze. Skepticism, perhaps even resentment. For a brief second, Sasha wondered whether this was just a coincidence or something deeper. Was she being treated differently because of who her father was? Or was it because she was a young black woman traveling alone? As the events of that day would reveal, this was more than just a bad airport experience. It was a reflection of the prejudices that many travelers face daily. Sasha was about to undergo a humiliating ordeal. But she wasn't alone in this struggle. Her story would resonate with thousands of people who had faced similar injustices. Business professionals detained for random security checks, students questioned about the legitimacy of their academic achievements, and ordinary travelers subjected to unjust suspicion simply because of their race or background. What should have been a simple journey would turn into an exposure of systemic bias. And Sasha Obama whether she wanted to or not, would become the voice of an issue much larger than herself. This introduction frames Sasha's experience within a broader social issue, helping the audience understand that this is not just a personal inconvenience, but a symptom of systemic discrimination. It builds empathy. By highlighting Sasha's excitement for the trip and the importance of her research, we make her a relatable protagonist. It creates suspense. The moment at the check-in counter foreshadows the problems ahead, making the reader feel the same unease that Sasha does. It sets up the key theme, the contrast between what airports should represent, opportunity, travel, freedom, and what they sometimes become, spaces of power imbalance and discrimination. Sasha approached the check-in counter with a sense of anticipation. She had her documents neatly organized in her tote bag, ready to present them without issue. The terminal was bustling with activity. Families saying goodbye, business travelers immersed in phone calls, and airport staff assisting passengers. Yet the moment she handed over her passport and boarding pass, she noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The airline employee took her documents and began typing into the system. Instead of a routine processing, the woman's fingers paused mid-keystroke. Her gaze flickered between the screen and Sasha, her expression unreadable. The moment stretched longer than usual, filling the space with a palpable sense of unease. "Your destination?" the woman asked. "New York," Sasha answered, still maintaining her polite tone. "Reason for travel?" Sasha hesitated for just a second. It was an unusual question at check-in. "I'm attending a scientific conference." The woman's brows lifted slightly as if the answer surprised her. Her tone remained flat, but the energy in her posture changed. She no longer seemed to be processing Sasha's documents. She appeared to be evaluating Sasha herself. "Do you have proof of this conference?" Sasha, slightly taken aback, nodded and reached into her bag. She retrieved a printed invitation letter from the event organizers, handing it over. The woman took it, her eyes scanning the text for what felt like far too long. A minute passed, then another. Sasha could see other passengers moving smoothly through check-in while she remained stuck at the counter. Finally, the woman handed the letter back. She didn't acknowledge it, nor did she apologize for the delay. Instead, she glanced back at Sasha's passport. "Your last name is Obama," she muttered. Sasha had grown used to people recognizing her name. Sometimes it came with admiration, other times curiosity. But there was something different in this woman's tone, something closer to skepticism. The airline employee didn't smile. She didn't engage in polite small talk as was common with other passengers. Instead, she seemed to hesitate, as if weighing her next words carefully. "A moment," she finally said, before stepping away from the counter. Sasha watched as the woman walked over to a colleague, whispering something in hushed tones. They glanced in her direction. The second employee's expression mirrored the first, a mixture of scrutiny and quiet suspicion. At that moment, Sasha felt something she couldn't quite name: frustration, anxiety, or perhaps a familiar sense of injustice creeping in. After a few long minutes, the airline employee returned. "Everything is fine," she said, though her voice lacked warmth. "You can proceed to security." Sasha exhaled, pushing aside her frustration. She knew something had been off about that interaction, but she tried to focus on getting through the next step, security screening. She picked up her bag, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the TSA checkpoint. But what she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Sasha placed her belongings onto the conveyor belt, following the usual security protocols. Her laptop, tote bag, and trench coat went through the scanner. She stepped into the body scanner, assuming this would be quick and routine. The machine beeped, and she waited for clearance. But instead of the usual, "You're good to go," the TSA agent motioned for her to step aside. "Random screening," he muttered. Sasha frowned. She had traveled enough to know that random screenings were rarely random. "Step over here," another officer instructed, guiding her to a secondary inspection area. She watched as one of the agents retrieved her tote bag, unzipping it with force. "Careful," she said, her voice firm but calm. The agent ignored her. He began rifling through her things with an unnecessary amount of aggression. flipping through her research papers carelessly, pushing aside her laptop as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. Then came the final insult. A small ink bottle, an antique gift from her grandmother, was knocked off the table. It hit the floor and shattered, deep blue ink spreading like a stain against the polished tiles. Sasha, frozen. Her chest tightened as she stared at the mess on the floor, the shattered glass glinting under the airport's harsh fluorescent lights. She looked up at the officer, expecting an apology. Instead, his expression remained blank, indifferent. "Stand back, ma'am," he said. Sasha felt something rise inside her, a mix of anger, humiliation, and sheer disbelief. "That was a gift," she said, her voice low but steady. The agent didn't respond. Instead, he moved to pat her down, his hands pressing against her arms and legs with mechanical efficiency. At this moment, Sasha realized the power imbalance at play. She was being treated as a suspect, not a traveler, and there was nothing she could do about it. By the time she was cleared from security, Sasha felt drained. Her confidence had been chipped away, little by little. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag, still mourning the loss of her grandmother's ink bottle, and proceeded to her gate. But as she handed her boarding pass to the agent, she noticed his expression shift. "A moment," he said. Sasha's heart sank. She watched as he picked up his radio, whispering something she couldn't hear. Another employee joined him. They both glanced at her before the man finally turned back. "Your ticket has been revoked. You're not permitted to board this flight." A beat of silence. "Waited, why?" "Security concerns," the agent said vaguely. "Security concerns?" Sasha's voice was rising now. "I've been through screening. I've answered every question. I've followed every rule. This is absurd." The agent merely shrugged. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you'll need to speak with customer service." Sasha felt her legs weaken. She had done everything right, and yet she was being denied her right to travel without explanation. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. There was only one person who could help her now. She dialed her father. This expanded section brings more depth and realism to Sasha's experience, by breaking down the step-by-step escalation, from check-in to security to the final denial at the gate, highlighting small moments of injustice, subtle expressions, pauses, and body language that reveal implicit biases, making the reader feel the frustration by allowing them to experience the slow realization of what's happening alongside Sasha. Ending on a suspenseful note, leaving the audience eager for the next part, a father's intervention, Barack Obama arrives. Sasha's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her phone. She hesitated for a moment before pressing the call button. She never liked involving her father in personal matters. He had spent years carrying the weight of the nation, and she wanted to handle her own problems. But this was different. The phone rang twice before she heard his voice, calm and steady as always. "Sasha, what's wrong?" The second she heard his tone, filled with warmth and concern, the weight of her emotions crashed over her. "Dad, they won't let me board." I pause. "What do you mean they won't let you board?" "They're saying it's a security issue, but they won't explain anything." Her voice was steady, but beneath the surface a storm of emotions swirled. Anger, humiliation, disbelief. On the other end of the line, Barack Obama was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was still calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority. "I'm on my way." 15 minutes later, the airport atmosphere shifted. Passengers still bustled about, announcements still blared overhead, but among the airport staff, a quiet tension had settled in. The former President of the United States had just entered the terminal. Barack Obama walked with purpose, not in a show of force, but with the air of a man who had spent years navigating crisis after crisis. Heads turned as he passed. Airport employees whispered to one another, exchanging anxious glances. When he arrived at the gate, he spotted Sasha immediately. She was standing near the customer service desk, arms crossed, frustration evident on her face. He looked up and met his eyes, and in that moment relief flooded her. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Obama turned to the airline's staff, his gaze unwavering. "I need an explanation." The gate agent, who had been so dismissive moments ago, now looked suddenly uncertain. He fumbled with his words. "Sir, this is just a misunderstanding. We were following security protocols." Obama's expression didn't change. "What security protocols specifically warranted my daughter's removal from this flight?" The agent shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we don't have to disclose internal security decisions." "Then let's make this clear," Obama said, his voice sharp. "You're telling me that a young woman who has already cleared security screening, who has answered every question asked of her, is being denied travel? Without a reason?" The silence that followed was deafening. A few feet away, Sasha watched as the power dynamic visibly shifted. Moments ago, she had been powerless, a single traveler against an unyielding system, but now the tables had turned. Barack Obama was not raising his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded accountability. The airline supervisor, an older woman with stiff posture, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Obama, we sincerely apologize. This was a mistake." Obama tilted his head slightly. "A mistake?" The woman nodded. "Yes, sir. Sasha is cleared to board her flight immediately." A small murmur rippled through the airport staff. Sasha almost laughed. Now it's a mistake, she thought. Just minutes ago, she had been treated like a security threat. But now that her father had arrived, suddenly it was all a misunderstanding. The hypocrisy stung. Sasha wanted to be relieved, but instead she felt a wave of frustration. Yes, she could board her flight now, but what about the people who didn't have a Barack Obama to call? How many black travelers had been treated the same way? How many were denied their rights without question? How many injustices went unnoticed because no one was watching? She glanced at her father. He seemed to understand her thoughts before she even spoke them. "This isn't just about you, Sasha," he said softly. "This is bigger than one flight." She nodded. Her father had fought for justice, fairness, and equality his entire life, and now it was her turn. As she walked toward the plane, boarding pass in hand, she made a silent promise to herself. This story won't end here. Sasha's ordeal wasn't an isolated event. Her story ignited a conversation online. Social media exploded with people sharing their own experiences of racial profiling at airports. A black scientist recalled being detained for over an hour because the TSA didn't believe he was a real researcher. A Latino entrepreneur was accused of smuggling simply because he carried expensive luggage. A Muslim mother was forced to undergo multiple screenings while traveling with her children. This wasn't just about Sasha. It was about an entire system that treated people differently based on race, status, and perception. Sasha's case only received attention because of her last name, but what about the countless others who went through the same experience? Without cameras, without media attention, without powerful connections? What happened at the airport that day wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a lesson in power, privilege, and justice. Sasha saw firsthand how quickly power could shift. One moment she was treated as an outsider, the next, with her father's presence, she was mistakenly denied travel. The world saw how fragile justice could be. When no one is watching, discrimination happens in silence. But when a powerful figure intervenes, suddenly the rules change. The fight didn't end at the airport. Sasha, like her father, was determined to use her voice. She later spoke out publicly, calling for better bias training in airport security and greater transparency in travel policies. Sasha's story is not unique, but her response, refusing to let it be ignored, is what turns one incident into a movement. How many more stories like Sasha's need to happen before real change takes flight?